Imagine being mocked and dismissed because of how you look, only to secretly hold the power to change everything. An old man, seen as a beggar, walks into a building full of scornful tenants, but what they don't know is that he's the new owner. This is a story about redemption, rebuilding hope and teaching a lesson that no one will ever forget. If this story touched your heart and reminded you of the power of resilience and hope, don't let it end here. Subscribe now to join us for more inspiring tales that prove kindness and courage can change the world, one story at a time. The sun was low in the sky, casting a golden hue over the crumbling apartment building. Its faded bricks told stories of better days, but now it stood tired and neglected, a shadow of its former self. A group of tenants lingered near the entrance, their voices sharp and mocking as they eyed the old man walking slowly up the cracked pavement. He wore a long, worn coat that hung loosely over his frail frame, its edges frayed from years of use. His scuffed shoes shuffled against the ground, and a battered leather bag swung gently at his side. "Looks like someone's lost," a man with slicked back hair sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. The others laughed, their disdain filling the cool evening air. A young woman in a tailored jacket crossed her arms and smirked. "Maybe he's here to collect cans. Wrong building for that, Grandpa." The old man paused just short of the group, lifting his head to meet their eyes. His face, lined with the years, carried a quiet strength that seemed out of place with his shabby appearance. He didn't flinch at their laughter, didn't snap back at their taunts. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a gold-trimmed pen, twirling it idly in his fingers as if lost in thought. The sight of it drew a momentary silence, the tenants exchanging puzzled glances. The man with slicked back hair recovered first, scoffing loudly. "Fancy pen for a beggar," he said, shaking his head. The old man smiled faintly, almost as if he found their words amusing. "Just passing through," he said, his voice calm and unhurried. It was the kind of voice that carried weight, that hinted at stories too long and rich to tell in passing. But none of them noticed the undercurrent in his tone. They were too busy dismissing him, too absorbed in their own self-importance to wonder why a man like him might carry himself with such quiet dignity. As he walked past, his eyes swept over the building. He saw more than the peeling paint and broken shutters. He saw memories. For a moment his hand brushed the iron railing of the front steps, a gesture so subtle it might have gone unnoticed. But to him, it was significant. This place had meant something to him once, though now it stood weathered and forgotten. The tenants resumed their chatter, their laughter fading into the background as the old man disappeared inside. They thought nothing more of him, assuming he was nothing more than a poor wanderer with no business in their lives. But deep in his pocket, his fingers tightened around the pen. Inside the dimly lit hallway, the old man moved with an air of familiarity. The building smelled of damp wood and mildew, a testament to years of neglect. The flickering overhead light cast uneven shadows along the cracked walls. He paused near a bulletin board cluttered with faded flyers and notices. Among them was a freshly pinned paper, an eviction notice bold and unforgiving in its wording. His gaze lingered on it, his eyes narrowing slightly. His expression betrayed no anger, only a quiet understanding that spoke volumes. Down the hall, voices carried from an open door. A woman's sharp tone stood out. "I told you, I'm already behind on rent. How am I supposed to pay extra when they're hiking everything again?" Her frustration echoed in the narrow space. The old man tilted his head, listening for a moment. He turned toward the voice, his steps slow but deliberate, and stopped just short of the doorframe. The scene inside was one of chaos. A young woman, perhaps in her late 20s, stood amidst mismatched furniture. Her face was tight with worry, her hands clutching a piece of paper, the same eviction notice he had just seen. She was pleading with someone on the phone, her voice growing more desperate. "I'm trying my best, okay? You think I don't want to move? I don't have that kind of money just lying around." She slammed the phone down, muttering under her breath as she sank onto a worn couch. Her shoulders sagged under the weight of her frustration, and for a moment she seemed utterly defeated. The old man stood there for a moment longer, his expression softening. There was something familiar about her, a resemblance he couldn't ignore. Quietly, he turned away before she could notice him, continuing down the hall. He stopped at another door, this one slightly ajar. A child's voice drifted out, humming a cheerful tune. The sound seemed to lift the gloom of the hallway, even if only for a moment. He peered inside, his eyes meeting those of a young boy sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by crayons and paper. The boy looked up, his face lighting up with a smile. "Hi," he said brightly, as if the old man's presence was the most natural thing in the world. The old man smiled back, his features softening. "Hello there," he replied, his voice low and gentle. "Are you visiting someone?" the boy asked, tilting his head curiously. "Just passing through," the old man said, his words measured. He glanced at the boy's drawing, a picture of a tall building with colorful windows. "That's a fine building you're drawing." "It's this one," the boy said proudly, "but I made it better. See? No cracks, and there's a big garden in front." The old man's gaze lingered on the drawing, a flicker of emotion crossing his face. "It's a good vision," he said softly. "Maybe one day it'll look just like that." The boy grinned and returned to his drawing, humming again. The old man straightened, his grip tightening slightly on the strap of his bag as he moved on. There was something about the boy's innocent optimism that stayed with him, stirring something deep within. He continued through the building, each step bringing more memories. The cracked walls seemed to echo with voices from another time, laughter, conversations, dreams that had once filled these halls. His journey ended at the back staircase, where he paused and looked up toward the upper floors. The air here was colder, the lights dimmer. The building had changed, yes, but its essence hadn't been entirely lost. Quietly, he murmured to himself, "Not yet." With that, he turned and made his way out, his steps slow but deliberate, as if measuring every corner of what was to come. The next morning, the tenants were abuzz with chatter in the courtyard, their voices rising and falling in heated debate. Rumors had begun to spread about the mysterious old man. Some said he was just a wandering beggar. Others speculated he might be a relative of someone in the building. A few dismissed him entirely. But his calm demeanor and the way he lingered around the property had sparked more curiosity than they cared to admit. Lisa, the young woman with the eviction notice, leaned against the railing of the front steps, watching the others talk. Her mind was elsewhere, replaying the events of the previous night. She had caught a glimpse of the old man walking past her door. His posture, the way he glanced at her, had felt oddly familiar. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the thought. There were more pressing matters, like figuring out where she and her son would go if the eviction went through. A man in a crisp suit strode into the courtyard, cutting through the morning noise. It was the landlord, Mr. Grayson, his face set in its usual expression of smug authority. He stopped near the notice board, tapping his polished shoes impatiently as he adjusted his tie. "Good morning, everyone," he said, his voice dripping with forced politeness. "I trust you've all seen the notices by now. As you know, the building's management is undergoing changes." His eyes scanned the crowd, lingering on Lisa for just a second longer than necessary, making her bristle. "And with those changes come new policies, higher rent, better tenants. That's the future we're working toward." The group muttered among themselves, some grumbling while others looked away, unwilling to confront him. Grayson smirked, clearly enjoying the control he held over them. "If anyone has concerns, feel free to speak with me. Though I can assure you, decisions have already been made." At that moment, the old man emerged from the building's side entrance, his steady footsteps drawing everyone's attention. His arrival silenced the murmurs, the tenants watching him with a mix of suspicion and curiosity. Grayson raised an eyebrow, taking in the man's disheveled appearance. "And you are?" Grayson asked, his tone laced with condescension. The old man looked at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Just passing through," he said simply, the same phrase he had used the night before. He glanced around at the tenants, his gaze lingering on Lisa and the boy by her side before settling back on Grayson. "I've seen this place before. It has potential." Grayson laughed, a short, sharp sound that echoed off the walls. "Potential? That's rich. I suppose you'd know all about potential, wouldn't you?" His eyes darted to the man's frayed coat and scuffed shoes, his smirk growing wider. "Well, if you're not a tenant, you're trespassing. Move along." The old man didn't react to the insult. Instead, he nodded slightly, his face calm as ever. "I'll be seeing you around," he said, his tone carrying a weight that no one could quite place. He turned and walked away, leaving the tenants and the landlord staring after him, a palpable unease settling over the group. As he disappeared down the street, Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this man than met the eye. Something about him, his quiet confidence, the way he seemed to see through people, lingered in her mind. For the first time in weeks, she felt a spark of hope, though she couldn't explain why. Later that day, Lisa sat at her small kitchen table, her eviction notice crumpled beside her. The apartment felt suffocating, its worn linoleum floors and peeling wallpaper a constant reminder of the uphill battle she faced. Her son, Ethan, sat cross-legged on the floor, scribbling in a coloring book. Every so often he glanced up at her, sensing her stress but too young to fully understand it. Lisa sighed, rubbing her temples. "What am I going to do, Ethan?" she muttered, more to herself than to him. She reached for her phone, hesitated, then dialed. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Lisa, I already told you I can't lend you any more money," the voice said before she could even speak. It was her older sister Sarah, her tone clipped and tired. "You need to figure this out on your own." "I'm not asking for money," Lisa said quickly, though her voice trembled. I don't know what to do. They're raising the rent again, and now this eviction notice. I don't have anywhere else to go." "Maybe it's time to move," Sarah replied. "That place is falling apart anyway. You should have left a long time ago." Lisa's grip tightened on the phone. "Move where? With what money? I have Ethan to think about." "Lisa," Sarah interrupted, her tone softening slightly. "I know you're trying, but sometimes you just have to accept that things aren't going to work out. Maybe it's time to ask Mom for help." Lisa's jaw tightened. "I'm not asking her for anything," she said firmly. "Not after what happened." A silence stretched between them, heavy and unresolved. Finally, Sarah sighed. "Well, I hope you figure it out. I have to go." The line went dead. Lisa set the phone down, her hand trembling slightly. She looked over at Ethan, who was watching her with wide eyes. Forcing a smile, she crouched down beside him and ruffled his hair. "Hey, kiddo," she said, her voice softer now. "What are you drawing?" Ethan held up his picture proudly. It was the same building as before, but this time he had drawn a man standing in front of it, a man with a long coat and a kind smile. Lisa frowned slightly, taking the picture from him. "Who's this?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "The man from today," Ethan said brightly. "The one who said the building has potential. He's nice. I think he's going to help." Lisa's chest tightened. "He's just a stranger, Ethan," she said, though her words lacked conviction. "People don't just show up and fix things." Ethan shrugged and returned to his coloring. "I think he will." Lisa stared at the drawing for a moment longer before setting it down. She couldn't explain it, but something about the old man had stuck with her too. His words, his calm demeanor. It all felt deliberate, as if he knew something the rest of them didn't. She shook her head, trying to push the thought away. Hope was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. Still, as the evening stretched on and the shadows grew long, she found herself glancing out the window, half expecting to see the man walking down the street again. The next day dawned with an unusual stillness. The usual chatter of the tenants in the courtyard was subdued, and even the faint hum of city life outside seemed muted. Lisa stepped out of her apartment to take out the trash, her thoughts preoccupied with mounting bills and unanswered questions. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, she noticed a few tenants gathered near the bulletin board again, their voices low and hushed. Curiosity piqued. She walked over and found herself looking at a new notice pinned to the board. The edges were crisp, the paper starkly clean compared to the older yellowed notices. It was addressed to all residents and bore the heading, "Management update pending. Important meeting scheduled." "What's this about?" Lisa asked, directing her question to one of the tenants, a middle-aged woman with her arms crossed tightly across her chest. "Who knows?" the woman replied, her voice tinged with suspicion. "Grayson's probably trying to squeeze more money out of us. Meeting's in the lobby tonight." Lisa frowned. Grayson rarely bothered with formalities like meetings. He preferred to send notices and let his threats do the talking. This was unusual. As the tenants began to disperse, Lisa's eyes caught something else, a faint glimmer of gold on the ground near the board. She crouched to pick it up and realized it was a pen, its surface intricately engraved, far too elegant to belong to anyone she knew. Recognition flickered in her mind. It was just like the one the old man had been holding the other day. Her thoughts raced, but she quickly pocketed the pen and returned upstairs. Ethan was waiting for her at the kitchen table, his drawings spread out in front of him. She set the trash bag aside and sat down, her fingers still loosely clutching the pen. "Did you see him again?" Ethan asked eagerly, glancing up from his papers. "See who?" she replied, though she already knew what he meant. "The man," Ethan said, his tone insistent. "I think he's here to help us." Lisa hesitated, the pen cool and heavy in her hand. She didn't know why she hadn't tossed it into her bag with the rest of her things, but something about it felt significant. "I don't know, Ethan," she said quietly. "Maybe he's just passing through." Ethan gave her a look that seemed far too knowing for a child. "He's not," he said firmly, and then returned to his drawing, leaving Lisa to stare at the pen in silence. That evening, the tenants crowded into the dimly lit lobby for the meeting. Grayson was already there, leaning casually against the reception desk, his posture radiating smug confidence. Lisa hung back, her nerves on edge. She noticed whispers among the tenants, their eyes darting toward the door every so often. Grayson cleared his throat, silencing the murmurs. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice smooth and practiced. "I'm sure you've heard the rumors, so let me set the record straight. Yes, the building has been sold. As of today, I am no longer your landlord." Gasps rippled through the room. Lisa's heart skipped a beat. The idea of Grayson no longer being in charge was a relief, but the uncertainty of what came next was even more unsettling. Grayson held up a hand to quiet the growing buzz. "Your new owner has asked for a little time before stepping forward publicly. In the meantime, I suggest you all cooperate. This change could be beneficial for those willing to adapt." The words hung in the air, vague and foreboding. Lisa glanced around at the other tenants, their faces a mixture of confusion and unease. She tightened her grip on Ethan's hand, her mind racing. Who would buy this building? And why would they keep their identity a secret? As Grayson wrapped up his announcement, Lisa noticed a movement near the back of the room. She turned her head sharply, her eyes searching the shadowed corners. For a brief moment, she thought she saw the old man standing there, watching. But when she blinked, the space was empty. Her stomach knotted with a strange mix of fear and hope. Something was happening, and it was bigger than she could understand. The following days brought an air of tension to the building. Tenants whispered in the hallways, speculating about the mysterious new owner and what their intentions might be. Grayson had disappeared, leaving behind little more than the vague promise of changes. The uncertainty gnawed at everyone, amplifying the already palpable unease. Lisa found herself preoccupied, the pen still tucked away in her pocket, as a strange reminder of the old man's cryptic presence. She hadn't seen him again, but every so often, she would catch a tenant talking about an odd visitor, or some old man wandering around. The stories varied. Some claimed he had been seen speaking with city officials. Others said he had simply been loitering by the building late at night. Each version made her wonder more about who he was and why he seemed so interested in this place. One afternoon, while Lisa was sorting through a box of old papers, Ethan came bounding into the room, his face flushed with excitement. "He's here," he announced breathlessly. Lisa's heart skipped. "Who?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "The man. He's outside by the garden." Ethan grabbed her hand, tugging her toward the door. Despite her initial hesitation, she followed, her pulse quickening as they made their way down the stairs and out into the courtyard. The garden, if it could even be called that, was a small patch of overgrown weeds and cracked soil on the side of the building. The old man stood there, his back to them, studying the ground with quiet intensity. His coat seemed even more worn in the daylight, but there was something commanding about the way he carried himself, as if the world around him didn't dictate his worth. "Hi," Ethan called out, breaking the silence. The old man turned slowly, his face lighting up with a faint smile when he saw the boy. "Hello again," he said, his voice calm and steady. His gaze shifted to Lisa, who stood frozen a few steps behind Ethan. "I see we meet again." Lisa cleared her throat, her nerves betraying her. "You've been around a lot lately," she said cautiously. "People are starting to talk." The old man nodded, seemingly unbothered by the comment. "People talk," he said simply, then glanced back at the garden. "It's amazing what you can grow when you start with the right foundation." Lisa frowned, unsure how to respond. "This place hasn't had a decent foundation in years," she said bluntly. "Grayson didn't care about anything but squeezing money out of people." The old man chuckled softly, a sound that carried both amusement and wisdom. "Foundations aren't always visible," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "Sometimes they're buried beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered." Ethan stepped closer, looking up at the man with wide eyes. "Are you going to help fix it?" he asked eagerly. The old man crouched down to meet Ethan's gaze, a kindness in his expression that made Lisa's chest tighten. "That depends," he said, his tone light. "Do you think it can be fixed?" Ethan nodded enthusiastically. "Mom says everything's broken, but I think it just needs someone to care." The old man smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "Smart boy," he said, ruffling Ethan's hair before straightening. He looked at Lisa again, his expression unreadable. Sometimes all it takes is the right person to see the potential. Lisa opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, the man tipped his head in a slight nod and began walking away. He moved slowly, his steps deliberate, as if every inch of the building's grounds held significance. Ethan started to follow, but Lisa gently held him back, her thoughts swirling. "Who are you?" she called after him, her voice louder than she intended. He paused but didn't turn around. For a moment it seemed he might ignore the question entirely. Then, without looking back, he said, "Just someone who remembers what this place used to be." With that, he disappeared around the corner, leaving Lisa standing in the garden, the weight of his words settling over her like a heavy blanket. Ethan tugged at her hand, his excitement undimmed. "See, he's gonna help," he said confidently. Lisa stared at the spot where the man had vanished, her heart pounding. She didn't know who he was or what he wanted, but something told her he wasn't just passing through. The evening brought an unusual stillness to the building. Lisa sat by her window, the faint hum of streetlights and the occasional sound of passing cars her only companions. Ethan had fallen asleep on the couch, his crayons scattered around him, and the old man's words echoed in her mind. Just someone who remembers what this place used to be. What did he mean by that? Lisa had lived here for years, long enough to see the building's decline, but she couldn't recall anyone who might have such a deep connection to it. The mystery gnawed at her, refusing to let her rest. Finally, she got up, grabbed the gold pen from her bag, and turned it over in her hands. The intricate engravings felt deliberate, purposeful, and something about them sparked a sense of familiarity she couldn't place. Unable to shake her curiosity, She opened her laptop and began searching. She didn't have much to go on, just a vague idea of the building's history and a few scattered details about the man. She typed in phrases like old building history and previous owners, scrolling through pages of unhelpful results until something caught her eye. A decades-old article, its headline faded but still legible. Local entrepreneur builds housing for low-income families, a vision of hope for the community. The accompanying photo was grainy, but Lisa's breath caught when she saw it. Standing in front of the very building she called home was a younger version of the old man. He looked different, stronger, sharper, but there was no mistaking the calm determination in his eyes. Her heart raced as she read the article. His name was Henry Mitchell, a self-made man who had risen from poverty to create affordable housing projects in the city. This building had been his first major success, a symbol of his determination to give back to the community. But the article ended abruptly, with no mention of what had happened afterward. Lisa leaned back in her chair, her mind reeling. The man who had been wandering their halls, dismissed as a beggar, was the original owner of the building. He wasn't just here out of nostalgia. There was something more to his presence, something deliberate. The sound of footsteps in the hallway pulled her from her thoughts. She froze, her eyes darting toward the door. The steps were slow, measured, and stopped just outside her apartment. Her breath caught as a shadow moved under the doorframe, lingering for a moment before continuing down the hall. Heart pounding, she hesitated before opening the door. The hallway was empty, save for a small slip of paper tucked beneath her welcome mat. She crouched to pick it up, her hands trembling slightly as she unfolded it. The note was handwritten in elegant, deliberate script. Foundations can be rebuilt. Be ready. Lisa stared at the note, her mind racing. She didn't know what it meant or why it had been left for her. But one thing was clear. Henry Mitchell wasn't here by coincidence, and whatever he was planning, it involved the building and everyone in it. The next morning, Lisa woke with a heavy sense of anticipation. She hadn't been able to shake the cryptic note or the discovery of the old man's past. Every sound in the building seemed amplified. The creak of footsteps on the stairs, the muted conversations of tenants, the hum of activity outside. It felt as if the entire place was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. After ensuring Ethan was settled with his toys, Lisa decided to dig deeper into Henry Mitchell's story. She remembered a community center a few blocks away that held archives of local history. Grabbing her bag and the note, she told Ethan she'd be back soon and hurried out the door. The streets were busy with the usual morning bustle, but Lisa's focus was singular. The community center was quiet, its walls lined with shelves of old newspapers, records, and photographs. She approached the front desk, where a kindly older woman greeted her with a warm smile. "Can I help you find something, dear?" the woman asked, adjusting her glasses. "I'm looking for information on a man named Henry Mitchell," Lisa said, trying to sound casual. "He used to own the building I live in, and I think he might have been involved in some local projects." The woman's face lit up with recognition. "Ah, Henry Mitchell. He was quite the figure back in the day, built a lot of housing for families who needed it. Let me see what we've got." She shuffled off toward the archives, leaving Lisa to fidget with the note in her hand. A few minutes later, the woman returned with a thick folder and set it on the table. "This should have what you're looking for," she said. "He was featured in quite a few articles. Such a kind man. It's a shame what happened to him." Lisa's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" The woman sighed, her expression turning somber. "There was some sort of betrayal. Business partners, I think. He lost everything. The buildings, his company, his reputation. It was tragic. But he disappeared after that. Never heard much about him again." Lisa felt a pang of guilt as she opened the folder. The first article was a glowing profile of Henry Mitchell's success. Photos showed him shaking hands with community leaders, smiling with families in front of newly built homes, and standing proudly in front of her building, which looked pristine and full of life. But as she flipped through the pages, the tone shifted. Headlines began to reference lawsuits, financial troubles, and allegations of fraud, though the articles didn't provide any solid evidence. The final piece in the folder was a short announcement of his company's bankruptcy. Lisa closed the folder, her chest tight. The man who had been mocked and dismissed in her building wasn't just another tenant or a wandering stranger. He was someone who had once fought for the very people now living there, and he had lost everything. "Thank you," she murmured to the woman, clutching the folder as she stood to leave. The walk back to the building felt heavier, the weight of what she'd learned pressing down on her. When she arrived, the courtyard was unusually quiet. A few tenants lingered by the bulletin board, their expressions wary. Another notice had been posted, this one bold and direct. "Mandatory tenant meeting tomorrow night, attendance required." Lisa stared at the notice, her stomach churning. Whatever Henry Mitchell was planning, it was coming soon. And she wasn't sure if it was something to fear or something to hope for. The day of the tenant meeting arrived, and the atmosphere in the building was electric with tension. Tenants whispered in the hallways, speculation and fear coloring their conversations. Lisa spent most of the day on edge, unsure of what to expect. Ethan, oblivious to the growing anxiety, was busy sketching another version of the building, this time with a sprawling garden and bright blue skies. As evening fell, Lisa dressed Ethan in a clean shirt and brushed her hair, wanting to present herself as composed, even if her insides were in knots. The lobby was already crowded when she arrived, the tenants packed tightly into the small space. The hum of nervous chatter filled the air, punctuated by the occasional sharp comment. "This better not be another rent hike," someone muttered. "Maybe they're just kicking us all out," another voice replied, laced with bitterness. Lisa stayed near the back, holding Ethan's hand tightly. Her eyes scanned the room for any sign of Henry Mitchell, but he was nowhere to be seen. Instead, a tall man in a dark suit stood at the front, his polished appearance starkly out of place in the rundown building. He carried a leather briefcase and had an air of authority that immediately quieted the crowd. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his voice steady and professional. "Thank you for coming. My name is Mr. Lawson, and I represent the new ownership of this property." Murmurs rippled through the group. Lisa's grip on Ethan's hand tightened. New ownership. The words felt like a riddle hanging in the air, unanswered and unsettling. Mr. Lawson continued, unbothered by the interruption. "I understand that change can be difficult, and I assure you that the new owner has no intention of making these transitions harder than necessary. In fact, they have a vested interest in preserving the community within this building." The tenants exchanged skeptical looks. Grayson had used similar language, and it had only ever meant bad news. Lisa felt a familiar anger rise in her chest. Words were cheap, and promises even cheaper. "Who's the new owner?" a tenant called out from the front. "Why aren't they here?" Mr. Lawson paused, his expression calm. "The new owner is very much present, though they've chosen to observe for now. In the meantime, I'm here to answer any questions you may have." The crowd grew restless, voices overlapping as complaints and concerns were thrown at the man. Mr. Lawson raised a hand, his calm demeanor never faltering. "All in due time," he said. "Before we proceed, I'd like to invite someone to speak. Someone who has a deep connection to this building and its history." Lisa's heart skipped. The room fell silent as the old man stepped out of the shadows near the back of the room. His worn coat and scuffed shoes contrasted sharply with the polished setting of Mr. Lawson's presentation, but his presence commanded attention. He walked slowly to the front, the crowd parting instinctively to let him through. As he reached the center, he turned to face them, his gaze sweeping over the room. Lisa could see the flicker of recognition on some of the tenants' faces as they realized who he was, or at least that they had seen him before. "I've watched this building for a long time," Henry began, his voice steady and rich with emotion. "Longer than most of you have lived here. I remember when it was full of life, a place where families could find hope and build a future." His words hung in the air, drawing the crowd in. Even the most skeptical tenants seemed captivated by the sincerity in his voice. But somewhere along the way, he continued. That hope was lost. Neglect took over, and the people who were supposed to care for this place turned it into something unrecognizable. It became just another line on someone's balance sheet. Lisa's breath caught. The weight of his words was undeniable, and the room seemed to hold its collective breath. "I've been dismissed, mocked, and overlooked," he said, his eyes meeting the crowd's. "And I let it happen because I believed there was still something worth saving here. This building, this community, deserves better." He paused, his voice growing firmer. "That's why I came back. Not to take anything from you, but to give back what was taken." A ripple of surprise moved through the crowd. Lisa's mind raced as she pieced it together. He wasn't just here to talk, he was here to change everything. Henry's calm gaze swept over the room once more, and when his eyes met Lisa's, she felt an unexpected wave of hope. For a moment, the room was utterly silent, the weight of Henry's words settling over the tenants like a heavy blanket. Lisa felt her pulse quicken as her mind churned with questions. She wasn't the only one. The other tenants began murmuring, their voices rising in a mixture of confusion and disbelief. "What do you mean, give back?" someone finally demanded, stepping forward. It was a wiry man in a tattered hoodie, his expression skeptical. "Are you saying you're the new owner?" Henry's calm gaze shifted to him. "That's exactly what I'm saying," he replied, his tone steady but firm. "This building belongs to me now, again." The murmurs swelled into a cacophony of disbelief. Tenants exchanged bewildered looks, some shaking their heads as if the idea were too outlandish to consider. Lisa felt her throat tighten. She glanced down at Ethan, who was looking up at Henry with wide, trusting eyes. He had believed in this man from the start, even when everyone else had dismissed him. "You expect us to believe that?" another tenant called out, crossing her arms. "You've been wandering around here like some lost beggar. Now you're telling us you're in charge?" Henry nodded slowly, his expression unchanging. "Appearances can be deceiving," he said simply. "I've spent my life learning that lesson, and it seems some of you have as well. I've walked these halls, watched how this building operates, and seen how you've been treated. I wanted to understand the challenges you face before I made my decision." Lisa's chest tightened as she absorbed his words. His presence in the building wasn't random. It had been deliberate, a calculated effort to see the reality of their lives. And now, he stood before them with a quiet power that left no room for doubt. Mr. Lawson stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Mr. Mitchell's acquisition of this property is not only legal, but final. He now has full ownership of the building and intends to implement significant changes that will benefit those willing to work with him." The mention of changes stirred the crowd again. "What kind of changes?" a woman near the front asked, her voice tinged with both hope and fear. "Are we all getting evicted?" Henry raised a hand, and the room fell quiet once more. "No," he said firmly. "No one who values this community will be forced to leave. My goal is not to displace anyone, but to rebuild what this building was meant to be, a safe, affordable home for hardworking families. That starts with holding everyone accountable, including those who've taken advantage of the system." The crowd murmured again, but this time it was different. There was a flicker of something new in their faces. Curiosity, perhaps even hope. Lisa felt it too, though she remained cautious. Words were one thing, but promises like these often came with strings attached. Henry turned his gaze to the bulletin board at the back of the room, where the eviction notices still hung like a dark cloud over the tenants. "Those notices," he said, his voice quieter but no less resolute, "are void. Effective immediately. No one here will lose their home because of the greed of the previous management." A collective gasp swept through the room, followed by a wave of relieved sighs and murmurs of disbelief. Lisa felt her knees weaken as she clutched Ethan's hand tighter. She hadn't realized how much the threat of eviction had weighed on her until now. "But," Henry continued, his tone sharpening, "this isn't a free pass. I expect everyone here to contribute to making this building what it can be. That means respect for each other, accountability for your actions, and a willingness to be part of something better. If you're not willing to do that, then perhaps this isn't the place for you." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Lisa watched as the tenants around her began to shift uncomfortably, some nodding, others glancing away. For the first time, she felt a glimmer of real possibility, a chance for something better. Henry's gaze swept the room one last time. "The future of this building isn't just in my hands," he said. "It's in yours too." With that, he stepped back, leaving the room buzzing with questions and tentative hope. Lisa stood frozen, her heart pounding. For the first time in years, she felt like the cracks in her life might actually start to mend. The room slowly began to empty, tenants drifting out in small groups, their conversations a mix of confusion, cautious optimism, and skepticism. Lisa lingered near the back, holding Ethan's hand tightly as she watched Henry Mitchell speak quietly with Mr. Lawson near the front. There was a composure to him that fascinated her, a quiet strength that seemed unshaken even by the waves of doubt rippling through the crowd. Ethan tugged on her arm, breaking her thoughts. "Can we go talk to him?" he asked eagerly, his eyes bright with excitement. Lisa hesitated. She wasn't sure what she would say to him, or if she even wanted to. This man had upended everything they thought they knew about their home, and while his promises sounded genuine, she couldn't ignore the nagging fear in the back of her mind. Could he really be trusted? But Ethan's hopeful expression wore down her resolve. "All right," she murmured, letting him lead her through the thinning crowd toward Henry. He noticed them approaching and turned, his expression softening when he saw Ethan. "Ah, my young artist," Henry said with a faint smile, crouching slightly to meet the boy's gaze. "Did you enjoy the meeting?" Ethan nodded vigorously. "Are you really going to fix the building?" he asked. "Mom says it's falling apart." Henry chuckled softly, his eyes glinting with amusement. "Your mom's not wrong," he said. "But yes, I am. It'll take some time. But I've seen this building at its best, and I believe it can be that way again." Ethan grinned and looked up at Lisa. "See, Mom, I told you he was going to help." Lisa forced a small smile, though her uncertainty lingered. She looked at Henry, her voice quieter than she intended. "You're asking a lot of people who've been burned before," she said. "We've heard promises like this before, from Grayson, from others. It's hard to trust someone we barely know." Henry straightened, his gaze steady but understanding. "I don't blame you," he said simply. "You've been let down, and words alone won't change that. But I'm not here to make empty promises. I'm here because I have a responsibility to this building, to the people in it, and to myself." His voice carried a quiet conviction that made Lisa pause. He wasn't trying to convince her. He was simply stating the truth as he saw it. There was something disarming about his honesty, something that made it difficult to doubt him completely. Ethan, oblivious to the weight of the conversation, tugged on Henry's sleeve. "Can I show you my picture?" he asked, holding up the latest version of his colorful drawing. Henry smiled, crouching again to look at it. His eyes softened as he studied the vibrant image of the building, its windows glowing with light and a lush garden blooming out front. "You've got a good eye," he said, his voice gentle. "This is exactly how I see it too." Ethan beamed, and for a moment, Lisa saw something shift in Henry's expression, an almost imperceptible flicker of emotion, as if Ethan's simple hope had touched something deep within him. Henry stood, his gaze returning to Lisa. "I know trust takes time," he said, "but I've learned that sometimes the best way to build trust is to take action. So, let me show you, and everyone else, that I mean what I say." Before Lisa could respond, Mr. Lawson approached, gesturing to Henry. "Sir, the contractors are ready for tomorrow's walkthrough. They'll need your approval on the initial plans." Henry nodded, his attention still on Lisa. "Excuse me," he said with a slight bow of his head, "but I'll be around. If you ever have questions or doubts, don't hesitate to ask." As he turned to leave with Mr. Lawson, Lisa stood frozen, her thoughts a whirlwind. Ethan tugged on her arm again, pulling her back to reality. "He's gonna fix everything," Ethan said confidently. Lisa glanced down at her son, then back at Henry's retreating figure. For the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of hope, fragile but undeniable. Maybe, just maybe, he was telling the truth. The next morning, the sounds of activity in the courtyard woke Lisa earlier than usual. She groggily pulled back the curtain and froze. Trucks lined the street outside, their sides emblazoned with the logos of various construction companies. Workers in hard hats were unloading equipment and speaking animatedly as they began surveying the building. The scene was a flurry of motion, and for a moment Lisa wondered if she was still dreaming. "Mom, what's happening?" Ethan asked, rubbing his eyes as he wandered into the room. Lisa didn't answer immediately. Instead, she grabbed her robe and stepped out into the hallway. Other tenants were peeking out of their doors as well, their expressions a mix of curiosity and confusion. The air buzzed with murmured speculation, the tenants trying to piece together what was going on. When Lisa stepped outside, she was met with the sight of Henry Mitchell standing near the trucks, speaking with a group of contractors. His coat was gone, replaced by a simple sweater, but his presence was as commanding as ever. Mr. Lawson stood beside him, clipboard in hand, nodding along as Henry gestured toward the building. Lisa approached cautiously, her steps hesitant but determined. She wasn't the only one. A small crowd of tenants had gathered, their questions growing louder as they edged closer to the scene. "What's all this?" one man called out, gesturing to the trucks. "What's going on?" Henry turned, his gaze sweeping over the gathering crowd. His expression was calm, but there was an unmistakable determination in his eyes. "Good morning," he said, his voice carrying easily over the noise. "I'm sure you're wondering what's happening, so let me explain." The crowd quieted, all eyes on him. "This building has been neglected for far too long," Henry began. "Its foundation is solid, but everything else needs work. Starting today, we're making changes, real changes. The repairs you've been asking for, the improvements you deserve, they're all part of this process." A woman in the crowd raised her hand hesitantly. "Does this mean the rent's going up?" she asked, her voice tinged with fear. Henry shook his head. "Number. My goal is not to push anyone out. The rent will remain affordable and the improvements will be done in stages to minimize disruption. I want this to be a place where people can thrive, not just survive." The murmurs started again, but this time they carried a note of cautious optimism. Lisa stepped forward, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "Why now?" she asked. "Why are you doing all this after so many years?" Henry met her gaze, his expression softening slightly. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply. "I've been away from this building for too long, but it's still my responsibility, and I intend to honor that." Before Lisa could respond, a contractor approached, holding a set of blueprints. Henry turned to study them, the conversation momentarily forgotten. Lisa stayed where she was, watching him interact with the workers, his movements deliberate and purposeful. As the crowd began to disperse, some tenants stayed behind, lingering near the courtyard to watch the activity. Lisa returned to her apartment, her mind racing. Henry's actions were undeniably real. He wasn't just talking anymore. The trucks, the workers, the blueprints, it was all happening. Ethan ran to the window, pressing his face against the glass. "Look, Mom, they're fixing it already," he said excitedly. Lisa smiled faintly, though her thoughts remained tangled. She wanted to believe in Henry, in his vision for the building, but a small part of her couldn't let go of the fear that it was all too good to be true. Still, as she watched the workers begin their repairs, a flicker of hope began to take root. For the first time in years, the building felt alive. The days that followed were a whirlwind of transformation. The once neglected building, with its peeling paint and creaking floors, became a hub of activity. Workers bustled in and out, their tools clattering as they tackled the repairs with precision. Scaffolding rose along the building's facade, and the sound of hammers and drills echoed through the halls. Lisa found herself drawn to the courtyard each day, joining other tenants as they watched the progress unfold. It was mesmerizing to see something long abandoned begin to regain its shape, as though the building itself was waking up after years of slumber. The energy was contagious, and for the first time, tenants who rarely spoke to one another began to exchange hopeful smiles and even lend small helping hands where they could. Ethan was perhaps the most enthusiastic of all. He insisted on keeping track of the changes, running back to their apartment each evening to add updates to his drawings. "They fixed the big crack by the stairs, Mom," he would say excitedly, his crayons working furiously to capture every detail. His optimism was infectious, and Lisa found herself smiling more often, even as her doubts lingered at the edges of her mind. On the fourth day of renovations, Lisa was making lunch when there was a knock at the door. Wiping her hands on a towel, she opened it to find Henry standing there, a faint smile on his face. He held a small potted plant in his hands, its leaves vibrant and green. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice as steady as ever. "May I come in for a moment?" Lisa blinked in surprise but stepped aside, gesturing for him to enter. Ethan looked up from his coloring book and immediately lit up. "Hi, Mr. Henry," he exclaimed, scrambling to his feet. Henry chuckled and handed the plant to him. "This is for you," he said. "A little greenery for your home. Every building needs a bit of life inside as well as out." Ethan held the pot carefully, his face glowing with delight. "Thanks, I'll put it by the window." As Ethan ran off to find the perfect spot for the plant, Henry turned to Lisa. His smile faded slightly, replaced by a more serious expression. "I wanted to talk to you," he said, "if you have a moment." Lisa nodded, her stomach tightening. She gestured toward the small table in the corner, and they both sat down. For a moment, Henry was quiet, his gaze fixed on his hands. "I know you've had your doubts," he began, his voice low but firm. "And I don't blame you. Promises like the ones I've made are easy to doubt when you've been let down before." Lisa didn't respond immediately, her thoughts swirling. "It's not that I don't want to believe you," she said finally. "It's just, we've lived like this for so long. It's hard to imagine things really changing." Henry nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he said. "But I've learned that the smallest steps can lead to the biggest transformations. This building, this community, it's worth fighting for. And so are the people in it." His words struck a chord, and Lisa felt a lump rise in her throat. She thought of the years she had spent in this place, struggling to hold everything together, and the quiet resilience she had seen in the faces of her neighbors. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. "Why are you doing all this?" she asked softly. "What's driving you?" Henry's eyes softened, and for a moment, she saw a flicker of vulnerability. "This building was my dream once," he said. "I poured everything I had into it, my time, my resources, my heart. Losing it, it broke something in me. But coming back here, seeing the life that still exists within these walls, it reminded me of why I started in the first place." Lisa nodded, her chest tight. She wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she simply met his gaze, hoping he could see the gratitude she couldn't yet put into words. Henry rose to his feet, his familiar calm returning. "Thank you for letting me speak with you," he said, "and for trusting me, even if only a little." As he left, Lisa sat in silence, her heart heavier but somehow lighter at the same time. For the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of something she had almost forgotten: hope. The renovations continued steadily, each day bringing visible changes that seemed to reflect the quiet resolve of the building's new owner. The once cracked walls were now smooth and freshly painted, the stairs reinforced, and even the flickering hallway lights had been replaced with bright, warm fixtures. A sense of optimism began to spread among the tenants, though it was still tinged with caution. Lisa found herself observing more than participating, unsure of where she fit into the unfolding transformation. Despite Henry's assurances and the progress she could see with her own eyes, a part of her still held back, afraid to fully embrace the hope that had started to bloom. One afternoon, she was sitting on the front steps, watching the workers unload yet another truck of materials, when Lisa noticed Henry standing nearby. He was speaking with a contractor, gesturing toward the roof, but there was something different about his posture. His usual calm was there, but his shoulders seemed slightly heavier, as if the weight of the work was beginning to show. Before she realized it, she was walking toward him. The closer she got, the more she could see the subtle lines of strain on his face. When he turned and saw her, he gave her a small, tired smile. "Lisa," he said, nodding. "Good to see you. How are you and Ethan holding up?" "We're fine," she replied, then hesitated. "How about you? You look tired." Henry chuckled softly, running a hand over his face. "I suppose I am," he admitted. "This kind of work, bringing something back to life, it takes a toll, but it's worth it." Lisa studied him for a moment, noting the sincerity in his voice. "Do you ever think it's too much?" she asked quietly. "That maybe it's not worth the fight?" Henry's smile faded, and his gaze grew distant. "There was a time when I did," he said. "After I lost the building the first time, I let myself believe it was gone forever. But walking away didn't bring me peace. It only left a hole I couldn't fill. Coming back here, seeing what this place could still be, it reminded me that some things are worth fighting for, no matter how hard it gets." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Lisa felt a pang of guilt for doubting him, for holding on to her skepticism even as he poured everything into this effort. She glanced toward the building, now a patchwork of old and new, and realized just how much had already changed. "You've done a lot," she said finally, her voice softer. "More than anyone else has." Henry looked at her, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he gave a faint nod. "Thank you," he said. "But there's still a long way to go, and I can't do it alone." Lisa frowned, caught off guard by his words. "What do you mean?" "I mean that this building isn't just mine," he said. "It belongs to everyone who lives here. If we're going to make it what it should be, it'll take more than just contractors and repairs. It'll take a community, a real one." Lisa swallowed, the weight of his statement settling on her. She thought of the tenants, many of whom had spent years barely speaking to one another, each consumed by their own struggles. The idea of them coming together, working toward a shared vision, felt almost impossible. But as she looked at Henry, she saw a man who had faced the impossible and refused to let it defeat him. If he could believe in this place, in its people, maybe she could too. "What do you need?" she asked finally, her voice quiet but steady. Henry's smile returned, softer this time. "Start with trust," he said. "The rest will follow." For the first time, Lisa felt herself relax, the walls she had built around her doubts beginning to crumble. She nodded, unsure if she could fully believe just yet, but willing to try. It was a small step, but as Henry had said, small steps could lead to big transformations. The following week marked a turning point. The renovations were progressing rapidly, and Henry's quiet persistence seemed to be having an effect on the tenants. People who had once kept to themselves began stepping out of their shells, volunteering to help in small but meaningful ways. Some painted walls in the hallways, others cleared debris from the courtyard, and a few even brought snacks and drinks for the workers. Lisa found herself swept up in the momentum. It started with small gestures, helping organize supplies for the workers, running errands, and even encouraging a few neighbors to pitch in. For the first time in years, the building felt alive with purpose, its tenants more like a community than isolated individuals merely coexisting under one roof. One evening, after most of the workers had left for the day, Lisa found herself in the courtyard, cleaning up the remnants of a long day's work. Ethan was playing nearby, darting between the scaffolding and giggling as he pretended to be a construction foreman. She was about to call him in for dinner when she noticed Henry sitting on a bench near the edge of the garden. He was alone, his usual composure tinged with a rare weariness. She hesitated for a moment before walking over, a bottle of water in her hand. "You look like you could use this," she said, offering it to him. Henry looked up, surprised, before accepting the bottle with a grateful nod. "Thank you," he said, unscrewing the cap and taking a sip. "It's been a long day." Lisa sat down beside him, the cool evening air wrapping around them. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the quiet punctuated only by the distant sounds of the city and Ethan's laughter in the background. "This place feels different," Lisa said finally, her voice thoughtful. "I've lived here for years, but it's never felt like this." Henry glanced at her, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Change has a way of doing that," he said. "Sometimes it takes a spark to remind people of what's possible." Lisa looked down at her hands, twisting the hem of her shirt. "I was skeptical at first," she admitted. "I didn't think anyone could really change this place. But seeing everything you've done, it's hard not to believe in it now." Henry's smile softened. "Skepticism is natural," he said. "I don't expect people to trust me overnight. Trust is earned step by step. And if this building has taught me anything, it's that small steps can lead to something greater." Lisa nodded, her chest tightening. She thought of the years she had spent in this building, struggling to hold on while the world seemed determined to take everything from her. Now, for the first time, she felt like she wasn't alone in that fight. "Why this building?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "There are so many others out there. Why come back here?" Henry's gaze turned distant, his expression thoughtful. "Because this place is more than just bricks and mortar," he said. "It's a symbol of what I wanted to create. A space where people could find hope, build something better for themselves. Losing it was one of the hardest things I've ever faced. But coming back, seeing the life still here, it reminded me of why it mattered so much in the first place." His words struck a chord, and Lisa felt a lump rise in her throat. She wanted to say something, to express the gratitude that had been growing inside her, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she simply nodded, hoping he understood. Ethan ran over then, his cheeks flushed and his eyes bright. "Mom, Mr. Henry, look what I made." He held up a new drawing, this one showing the building fully restored, with flowers blooming in the courtyard and children playing in the garden. Henry took the drawing carefully, his smile widening as he studied it. "You've got quite the vision," he said, looking at Ethan. "I think we might just make it happen." Ethan beamed, and Lisa felt her chest tighten again, this time with something that felt a lot like hope. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this building, and the people in it, could truly have a future worth fighting for. The final stages of the renovation brought a new kind of energy to the building. Workers were now focusing on the finer details, polishing floors, installing new fixtures, and even repainting the courtyard benches. The scaffolding came down, revealing the building's facade restored to its former glory. The once faded bricks gleamed in the sunlight, and vibrant flower boxes now lined the windows. The tenants, too, were different. Where once there had been suspicion and isolation, there was now a growing sense of unity. Neighbors who had barely exchanged words were now sharing meals and helping each other with small tasks. Lisa found herself in the middle of it all, organizing potlucks and encouraging others to contribute ideas for the building's future. Ethan had taken to calling the courtyard "our new park" and spent hours playing there with other children. His laughter echoed through the space, a sound that seemed to symbolize the change happening around them. Lisa watched him one afternoon as she leaned against the freshly painted railing, a rare moment of peace settling over her. Her thoughts were interrupted by Henry's voice. "It's amazing how much life a little color can bring," he said, stepping beside her. His eyes were on Ethan, his expression warm but reflective. Lisa smiled. "It's not just the color," she said. "It's everything. You've done more for this place than anyone else ever has." Henry shook his head slightly. "I didn't do it alone," he said. "This building wouldn't be what it is now without all of you. Community isn't something you build by yourself. It takes everyone." Lisa nodded, the truth of his words sinking in. She thought of the tenants who had come together in ways she never thought possible. It was as if Henry's determination had sparked something in all of them, something they hadn't realized they were capable of. As if reading her thoughts, Henry turned to her, his expression serious. "I've been meaning to talk to you about something," he said. "The renovations are almost complete, but the work doesn't end there. This building needs leadership, someone who knows the tenants, who understands their needs, and can help keep this community strong." Lisa blinked, caught off guard. "You mean someone like me?" Henry smiled faintly. "Exactly like you," he said. "You've already been doing it, whether you realize it or not. People trust you, Lisa. They look to you. And this place will need someone who can help guide it forward." Lisa's heart raced. She wanted to protest, to tell him she wasn't qualified, but the words wouldn't come. Deep down, she knew he was right. Over the past few weeks, she had found herself stepping into a role she never thought she could handle, and somehow it had felt natural. "I don't know," she said finally, her voice hesitant. "What if I mess it up?" Henry's gaze softened. "You won't," he said, "because you care. And that's what matters most." The weight of his words settled over her, but instead of feeling overwhelmed, she felt a quiet determination take root. Maybe she could do this. Maybe for the first time, she could be part of something bigger than just survival. Before she could respond, Ethan ran over, holding a small bouquet of flowers he had picked from the newly planted garden. "These are for you, Mr. Henry," he said, thrusting them toward him with a wide grin. Henry took the flowers, his smile spreading. "Thank you, Ethan," he said, his voice warm. "They're perfect." As Ethan ran off to play again, Henry looked back at Lisa. "Think about it," he said gently. "You don't have to decide right away." Lisa nodded, her mind already spinning with possibilities. As she watched Henry walk away, a sense of purpose began to take shape within her. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. The building's grand reopening was set for the following weekend, and the air buzzed with excitement. Henry had insisted on celebrating the transformation, inviting tenants to contribute ideas for the event. There would be food, music, and activities for the kids, a true community gathering to mark the start of a new chapter. Lisa found herself swept into the preparations, working alongside neighbors she had only nodded to in passing before. The courtyard was cleaned and decorated with string lights, balloons, and tables draped with colorful cloths. Someone brought a sound system, and another volunteered to organize games for the children. For the first time, the building felt like a home, not just for individuals, but for a community. Ethan was particularly thrilled, darting around to help set up and chatting with anyone who would listen about his favorite parts of the renovations. Lisa couldn't help but smile as she watched him, his happiness infectious. The day before the event, Henry called a meeting in the courtyard. All the tenants gathered, curious about what he had to say. He stood in the center, his presence commanding yet approachable. "First, I want to thank all of you," he began, his voice steady. "What we've accomplished here isn't just about fixing a building. It's about rebuilding a community. And that wouldn't have been possible without each of you." A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd, many of the tenants nodding in agreement. Henry paused, letting the words sink in before continuing. "This is just the beginning," he said. "The work doesn't stop here. Keeping this community strong will take effort from all of us. But I believe in what we've built together, and I know we can make it last." Lisa felt a swell of pride at his words. She glanced around, seeing the same sentiment mirrored in the faces of her neighbors. For the first time, there was no doubt in her mind that they could keep this momentum going. Henry turned to Lisa, his gaze steady. "And that brings me to something important," he said. "I've spoken with many of you over the past few weeks, and one thing has become clear. This building needs a leader, someone who knows the people, who cares deeply about their well-being, and who can help guide this community forward." Lisa's heart raced as she realized what was coming. She opened her mouth to protest, but Henry raised a hand to stop her. "I know what you're going to say," he said with a small smile. "That you're not ready or that someone else might be better suited. But the truth is, Lisa, you've already been leading. People trust you because you've earned that trust. And I can't think of anyone better for the job." A wave of applause erupted from the tenants, catching Lisa completely off guard. She looked around, seeing the encouraging smiles and nods of her neighbors. Even Ethan was clapping enthusiastically, his face beaming with pride. Lisa felt her cheeks flush. She wasn't used to being in the spotlight, let alone being the center of such overwhelming support. But as the applause continued, she felt a sense of clarity. This wasn't just about her. It was about all of them, about the community they had built together. When the applause finally died down, she took a deep breath and stepped forward. "I'll do my best," she said, her voice steady despite the nerves fluttering in her chest. "Thank you for trusting me." Henry nodded, his smile warm. "We're in this together," he said. "That's what makes it work." The crowd began to disperse, their excitement renewed as they continued preparing for the event. Lisa stood there for a moment, watching as her neighbors worked together, laughing and talking like old friends. For the first time, she felt a deep sense of belonging. As she turned to head back to her apartment, Henry caught her arm gently. "You're going to do great," he said quietly. "I can see it already." Lisa nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Thank you," she said, and for the first time she truly meant it. The day of the grand reopening arrived, and the courtyard buzzed with life. Music played, children laughed, and tables overflowed with food brought by the tenants. The building, once a symbol of despair, now stood tall and vibrant, a testament to what they had achieved together. Henry watched from the side, his usual calm replaced by a rare expression of pride. Lisa stood near the center, chatting with neighbors and keeping things organized, her presence now a natural part of the building's heartbeat. Ethan darted around, showing off his drawings of the new building to anyone who would look. As the sun set, Henry stepped forward to say a few words. "This isn't just a building," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "It's a home, a place built on trust, care, and community. And tonight, I see that it's stronger than ever." The tenants cheered, their applause echoing into the night. Lisa looked around, her heart full. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was just surviving. She was part of something bigger, something worth fighting for. As the celebration wound down, Henry approached Lisa. "You've got this," he said simply, a knowing smile on his face. Lisa nodded, her doubts finally replaced by confidence. "We've got this," she replied. And with that, the building's next chapter truly began. The transformation of the building was more than just a physical repair. It was a testament to the power of resilience, community, and hope. Henry's journey reminded everyone that even when something seems broken beyond repair, it can be rebuilt with enough determination and faith. Lisa's story showed that leadership doesn't come from perfection, but from the willingness to care and act. Together, the tenants proved that true strength lies in unity, and that even the smallest steps can lead to monumental change. Life often gives us second chances, not to undo the past, but to build something better from it. All it takes is belief in oneself and the courage to embrace those opportunities. This story is a reminder that change starts with us. Whether it's in your home, community, or personal life, take that first small step toward making things better. Share this story if it inspired you, and let's create a ripple of hope and transformation together.